This assignment is designed to look at the slave labor process and the transition to permanent involuntary hereditary servitude by the use of slave codes. By the end of this class, you should be able to have an understanding of these terms, complete the sheet for the required sources, and then be able to connect to the themes. And it looks like all themes will be addressed because they are all highlighted. So the first thing we're going to look at is the system of stratification among slaves themselves. We're looking at house slaves, field slaves, and then the dozens, which were addressed in another class. For more information, feel free to click the links, which will take you to a speech from Malcolm X, as well as a clip from the movie. And if you don't recall, the dozens were the slaves who were purchased by the dozen because of whatever medical issue that they would have. And we're looking at how a system of division among the slaves starts to develop. In this slide, we're looking at the slave auction. Here we see the names, we see the age, and then notice how we have various tasks: field hand, field hand, field hand, field hand, house, and confidential servant. So this individual right here is probably going to have it a little easier in comparison to the field slave. In this image, which is a required source, we see a group of slaves working in the field. When you're working in the field, that is known as the gang system, as opposed to the task system, which would involve one particular task to complete. We see yet another term here, which is the evolution of a language that is a mixture of African as well as what it means to be an African American or a slave for this particular time period. So the slave is starting to develop a merging of cultural identity, merging what their experience was like in Africa in comparison to what's going on in America. For this slide, you're going to develop a labor version of resistance. You're trying to put yourself in this particular situation. How can you resist? Can you do this through violent means? What is the process? Maybe what you do is get everybody here to slow down their rate of production, which could be viewed as a form of resistance. And notice how there is a child. Keep in mind, the institution of slavery does not really care about the age of a slave. And we'll see what that process looks like when a mother has a child, whether or not that child is born free or born a slave, because that is part of the permanent involuntary hereditary servitude. Here we see a image that is from the AP framework. Here you see the summary description. And then we transition to an excerpt from this particular narrative of a slave, as it indicates here. This individual was born a free man, then kidnapped, and then rescued. And this is a first-hand account of what it was like to be a slave. In this section, it talks about his family history, the role of his father, how his father instilled some form of education, and then he gets to his summary of account of what he experienced as a slave. This slide is looking at Harvard and how Harvard conducted this study to determine whether or not they benefited from slavery. This is the result. And so what we're looking at here are American institutions that may or may not have benefited from the institution of slavery. And Harvard is acknowledging that there was some form of benefit through the institution of slavery. Now for this slide, we're going to start looking at the laws that slowly take the freed slave and make them permanent involuntary hereditary servitude, or slaves, which basically means you are a slave, your children will be slaves, it is against your will, and there is nothing you can do about it. Keep in mind that this process is going to take place over a series of years, as well as a series of laws that will be passed. Keep in mind, in the U.S. Constitution, it does reference the year 1808, and in the year 1808, that will be the time where Congress can actually do something about the importation or about slavery. But as far as the Constitution is concerned, the migration or importation of such persons, and the people they are talking about here are slaves that shall not be prohibited by the Congress, which basically means that Congress cannot stop the importation of slaves, at least until this particular year. So again, we're going to start looking at some of the laws and how the laws slowly get to permanent involuntary hereditary servitude. And the slave codes were a series of laws designed to lead to this particular outcome. What I want you to do is look through the laws and determine which part of the laws would result in PIHS. Here we see a series of laws. This timeline indicates that the first Africans coming over were indentured slaves or indentured servants, which means eventually they will be set free. And you see the years here, and then here and there you'll see states like Virginia. You see Virginia again, Massachusetts. Here is a zoomed in version of this timeline, and you'll notice that it does say black codes. All persons except Negroes are to be provided with arms. We see here that they are barred from military service. The mother's social status will determine if the child is free or not. White women who marry black men are slaves. And this section gives absolute power and authority over slaves by the slave owner. Here we see another sample of the series of laws. This is from 1724, and it's looking primarily at the Louisiana slave codes. This section is concerned about religion, as it says here, impart religious instruction. Sundays and holidays are to be strictly observed. All Negroes found at work on these days are to be confiscated. They make use of this word confiscated a couple of times, as it mentions here, under the direct supervision of any person other than a Catholic. So I guess if the person supervising the slaves is not a Catholic, that could be grounds for confiscation. This section is looking at the intermarriage, which is eventually going to lead to sexual activity among free enslaved people. And when we look at this particular section here, this is where this eventually ends up going. So the key issue here is if we have two people, this individual is free, this individual is a slave. If they produce a child, the question here is, will the child be free or slave? And eventually you're going to see the law pass where it says social status will be determined by the mother. This will have some pretty harsh conditions with regard to the issue of sexual assault and rape, because keep in mind the female slave is property. And this section here looks at children issued from the marriage of slaves shall follow the conditions of their parents. Now we're looking at the issue of marriage. If the husband be a slave and the wife a free woman, it is our will that their children, or whatever sex they may be, shall share the condition of their mother. We forbid slaves to carry offensive weapons, and keep in mind the year here is 1724. Here we see some additional language here. Notice the use of the phrase absolute slaves. And some of this is going to change after the Stono Rebellion. In this particular rebellion, 20 slaves rebelled, killed a group of white people, and this was a form of violent resistance to slavery, unlike the work stoppage that was mentioned before. Here we see some images of this rebellion. And eventually what this is going to lead to is the state passing additional legislation after the Stono Rebellion to pretty much put more constraints on slaves to prevent a comparable revolt from taking place. Here again, we're talking about the offspring born or to be born shall be hereby declared to be and remain forever absolute slaves. How did the rebellion prompt change in legislation? What we're looking at here is some more harsh treatment. Keep in mind this is after the revolt, as it indicates here. Without a white person in his company shall be punished with whipping. This is the process of slave breaking, which was an actual thing where you could beat your slave into submission. Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. What's going on here is we're trying to determine what language of the Constitution references slavery. And keep in mind, we did talk about the 3/5 compromise. earlier, and that would be some language looking at the role of slaves. So they are mentioned in the Constitution, whether directly or indirectly, I guess, is open to interpretation. We then move on to this particular fugitive slave clause, and keep in mind, as slaves are escaping and trying to go into free states, they are going to argue that they are free, which is going to prompt slave owners or states with slavery to demand that the federal government pass legislation to do something about this. As it mentions here, no person held to service or labor in one state under law thereof escaping into another be discharged. So what this is saying is that even if you are a slave and you flee to a free state, that does not mean that you are free. It does not discharge you from such service, which is precisely the situation that Dred Scott is going to find himself in, which is going to lead to the Dred Scott decision. In this scenario here, Dred Scott finds himself in a situation where he is claiming to be free because he is in a state that is now no longer a slave state. And the question here from this document, which is again another required document, can a Negro whose ancestors were imported into the country and sold as slaves become a member of the political community? And so that's what this document is looking at, that particular question. And if you're not familiar with the case, the end result is that Dred Scott is not a citizen, therefore he is not even allowed to utilize the benefit of the court. At the end of this class, you should have an understanding of these particular terms. Make sure you complete the sources. And again, these are all of the themes that were addressed for this particular class. If you want to check your definitions, feel free to use this slide.